This is the Kratom Science Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Gallagher, blog and social media writer for KratomScience.com, your source for all things Kratom. My guest is one of the major critics of the war on drugs and an advocate for science-based harm reduction policy. He is founder of the Drug Policy Alliance, an organization that's been instrumental in marijuana legalization and helped to solicit comments for the 2016 fight to keep Kratom legal, among other projects. Rolling Stone magazine called him the real drug czar. He has a new podcast called Psychoactive. It's an honor to have on our podcast Dr. Ethan Nadelmann. Really like the podcast. I've gotten through most of the episodes, and
great.
It sounds good. A lot of people I'm fans of on there, like Dan Savage. You got Dr. Weil, Michael Pollan. You had Nora Volkow on, and she's the head of National Institute on Drug Abuse. You told her drug research today in America is like doing social science research in the Soviet Union. Is it only the legality of drugs that get in the way, or is there just a general anti-drug mentality that perseveres even in the sciences?
Well, I mean, it's not generically anti-drug, right? Because sometimes the U.S. government agencies can be more open on this stuff. I mean, just looking over the website of Kratom Science, that you can see that there's divisions within the U.S. government about how to view kratom, which is an essentially illegal drug. You can see, there's beginning to be more of an evolution on psychedelics. One of the things I mentioned in the podcast with Nora Volkow was that some of the other agencies within NIH, within the National Institute of Health, are already beginning to move forward a little more proactively on the psychedelics research, whereas NIDA has been really slow on this. And, they've approved a little bit of research on ketamine and treatment of addiction, ketamine being the one legal psychedelic drug. But they've shot down other proposals on psilocybin, including a really important potential study on psilocybin and treating cigarette addiction. I think they'd had a tiny little study in that area, and then there was a follow-up which got an incredibly high score from NIDA, which should have meant that the grant would be approved, but it got shot down. And I can only assume that must have been for some sort of political reason near the top. So it's about, look, the illegality of drugs and the kind of prejudices about them typically go hand in hand, but it's complicated, right? We know that opioids, right? Some are legal and are recommended for this and that, and others are totally illegal, and some are in between. So there's no generalizing about it. When I said to Nora Volkow, that for many years it seemed to me that trying to do innovative, research on drugs and drug research and drug treatment, drug abuse, drug markets, whatever, in the U.S. is a bit like trying to do, innovative social science research in the old Soviet Union. What I follow that up by saying is that what happens is that the researchers, quickly learn that there are certain questions that the funding agencies and the authorities don't really want to have asked and don't really want to have answered. And that if you persist in asking those questions or in coming up with the wrong answers, you may find yourself being disfavored when you're applying for grants thereafter. You may find your phone calls less likely to be returned. You may find that your proposals are sent to reviewers who are known to be hostile. There's all the subtle ways in which scientific research and other academic research can be suppressed and discouraged without actually locking people up, right? Without actually, hurting them in the way that we sometimes associate with authoritarian states. Mm-hmm. And you also see that I think what happened in the U.S., as I think happened in the old Soviet Union, is that many researchers start to develop political blinders so that they avoid asking those questions and giving those answers. And then at some point, those political blinders evolve into kind of intellectual blinders, so that the point that they almost stop asking those questions, stop even thinking in those directions. And when you look at the amazing amount of money that's the National Institute on Drug Abuse, I mean, billions and billions of dollars on drug abuse research, providing 80 to 90% of all the drug abuse research funding in the world. When you look at the dozens, if not hundreds, of really interesting and important questions that they could be funding researchers to answer, you realize there's something fundamentally non-scientific going on there. And mind you, I mean, part of what came through in the interview with Nora Volkow, she was being very discreet, was that, she wants to see herself as first and foremost a scientist, but she has to answer to both her higher ups in the administration, which included not just Democrats, but Republicans, Trump and Bush, and she has to answer to congressional committees. And those things are highly political. And many of the people in Congress have no inhibitions about politicizing science. And primarily, I point that criticism at the Republicans, but it's even sometimes true of Democrats. Mm-hmm. So, that is what we're running into. It definitely is what we're running into.
And, well, we were lucky because we got well, not me, but the University of Florida got $7 million last year specifically for Kratom research. So that was actually a good thing.
And that was from the National Institute on Drug Abuse?
Yeah, that was from NIDA.
And that was to study the efficacy of Kratom for treating drug addiction?
It probably has something to do with drug addiction, because since it is drug abuse. However, it's like I had the head of pharmacodynamics, Dr. Lance McMahon, on, and they're basically studying like the mechanism of how it works, and the metabolism on the brain receptors and things like that. And I think they're looking for, ways it can be, because it's a partial opioid agonist, so they're looking for ways it can be a safer painkiller, since, that's, as you would expect, that's probably in demand now since with the opioid crisis and everything.
Well, I'll tell you that one of the things that, one of my frustrations I expressed in talking with Volkow on my podcast was that, there's a lot of effort going in and funding directed to looking at how these substances operate on the brain and what they do. But I'm not convinced that that's the most useful way to spend this money. I mean, to my mind, the first thing I'd want to do if I was heading an agency like that is to really find out what's going on. And when you have a remarkable number of anecdotal reports about, is it Kratom or Kratom? What's the
we haven't decided yet.
Okay.
It's anybody. We say Kratom, but anybody. It's like take your pick.
Yeah, and you see all these reports and anecdotes about people finding that Kratom helped them put an opioid problem behind them, or to stay off of opioids.
Mm-hmm.
Never mind the kind of moderate, relaxing substitute for caffeine type effects. What I want to do is to interview thousands of people who have tried Kratom to deal with an opioid issue and collect as much information as possible about who they are and how they were using it and what their experiences were. Because to my mind, what's actually working for people to put a real drug problem behind them, or to at least get a handle on it, that's what's more important. And how it actually works in the brain is important as well, but I think that fades in significance compared to understanding how this stuff really works for people. That key question, and then knowing, is there a sufficient safety margin so that people aren't using something that's an effective medication for one thing, like addiction, but it turns out it's creating even worse problems in another way. Right?
Yeah. And I should say the name of your podcast is Psychoactive, and comes out every Thursday, right?
It's been coming out every Thursday.
Yep.
I think last week we delayed a bit because I wanted to have on one of the world's leading experts on tobacco harm reduction in e-cigarettes. Mm-hmm. And we were expecting the FDA to come out with a big announcement about which of the big companies they were going to allow to continue selling e-cigarettes and under what conditions. And so we pushed back that one until a Friday, and then the FDA basically asked for more time, and so nothing happened. But yeah, it's coming out every Thursday. There's, I think, 10 episodes that are up as of right now, mid-September. and plus my little introductory monologue. iHeartMedia, I'm very impressed. They've been promoting the hell out of it. So I'm getting over 100,000 downloads roughly on the episodes within a few weeks.
That's great.
A very good number. And we'll have to see, if they don't keep the marketing up, I'll have to see what the core audience is going to look like and just hope it keeps expanding.
Yeah, I'm sure anybody that listens to this will definitely be interested.
Brian, one of the challenges, of course, is that, I'm covering the entire spectrum of drug issues. Mm-hmm. So, 1 week it'll be about the overdose crisis. The next week will be about how, New York legalized marijuana and created a new gold standard for marijuana regulation. And then I might have Andy Weil or Tim Ferriss or Dan Savage talking in a broad-based way, or Michael Pollan talking about his latest book, or, Yale professor James Foreman talking about racism and the drug war and the debate within the Black community over the drug war. So the question is whether people are going to want to keep tuning in for subjects that the only thing they share in common is that they have to do with a psychoactive drug, and I'm the host, right?
Yeah.
I'm assuming I'm going to do an episode sometime, on Kratom.
Yeah.
And I'm going to do episodes on other kind of, all drugs that are less maybe in the popular discourse. So I'm thinking about doing an episode about sleep. I'm thinking about doing one on placebos. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of doing, I'm hoping to get a few, prominent politicians talking about current legislation. Yeah. I'm hoping to do some stuff that looks at the drug war in Mexico or the Philippines or things like that. So it's really going to cover a really broad spectrum, and hopefully there's a market out there for people who are interested in things across the board, or who get pulled in because they like the way I'm talking about these issues. We'll see.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of the Drug Policy Alliance, which you founded. You started with the Lynn Smith Center, is that Linesmith, in 1994. Yeah. Can you tell me about Alfred Lynn Smith, who's the center was named for?
Sure. What I can tell you first of all is, I got going on this issue back in the 80s when I wrote my PhD dissertation on the internationalization of policing and drug control. And I actually worked even in the State Department's Narcotics Bureau for a year as a consultant, and interviewed drug enforcement, other agents like in 19 countries around the world, both U.S. and foreign. And then I started teaching at Princeton in the late 80s when the drug war was going crazy, and started writing and speaking about how this was the wrong way to go, and kind of, all of a sudden popped out into kind of media fame, had a few runs of 15 minutes of fame in 1988, 89, 90. And at that time, there was an organization called the Drug Policy Foundation that had just been created that was bringing together people who were critical of the drug war and did not necessarily agree what the solution was, but who recognized that the drug war was the wrong thing. And then in the early 90s, I got a call out of the blue from a philanthropist named George Soros, inviting me to lunch. And he was intrigued by this drug issue. We hit it off, and I started teaching him about harm reduction and, things like that. And so I left Princeton in 94, and I had introduced Soros to the Drug Policy Foundation. So we started funding their work. But then I wanted to create my own little, interdisciplinary center on drugs and drug policy, either at a university, or then Soros asked me to do it within his foundation. And I decided to name it after Alfred Lindesmith. And Alfred Lindesmith was a sociologist, professor of sociology at Indiana University from roughly the 30s to the 60s. And he was really the first prominent academic to challenge conventional thinking about drugs, drug addiction, and drug policy. He wrote one book on opioid addiction, another one on addiction in the law. He was really a kind of cutting-edge thinker, way ahead of his time. He was persecuted in various ways by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. I think they tried to get him fired. But he really was one of the few people standing up early to challenge the conventional thinking. And so I just thought, if I'm going to start an interdisciplinary center on drugs and drug policy, what better than to name it after Alfred Lindesmith? Now, of course, the problem was, people struggled, who is Linda Smith, right? People, it was the people, working with me always had to spell out the name, it was confusing to people. But we kept that name for 6 years. and built both a program nationally and internationally around drug policy reform and focusing on a range of issues, harm reduction issues, marijuana issues, the bigger drug war issues. And then after 6 years, in the year 2000, Soros and I had agreed that at some point I would spin my institute out into an independent organization. But at that time, the Drug Policy Foundation had fallen on hard times. So what I did was I spun my Linda Smith Center out of Soros's foundation, which was called the Open Society Institute, merged it with the Drug Policy Foundation, and created what's become known as Drug Policy Alliance. And so that's been the name for roughly 20 years now, as DPA, Drug Policy Alliance, grew to be really the biggest and most successful drug policy reform organization, not just in the U.S., but around the world.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize to the listeners how instrumental this organization was in changing the marijuana laws, and I guess the first major victory was in California. Was that?
Well, that's right, Brian. I should say, by the way, it's that really most of DPA's work fell into three areas, right? One third was the marijuana issue, which involved legalizing marijuana first for medical purposes and then more broadly, but also, trying to reduce marijuana arrests, trying to reduce the racial injustice and disproportionality in marijuana arrests, and also pursuing decriminalization where legalization was not possible. So that was about one third of the work, although it got about 80% of the headlines. And then the second third of the work was about rolling back the role of the drug war in mass incarceration. So that focused on, getting rid of mandatory minimum sentences for nonviolent drug offenses. It focused on providing alternatives to incarceration for people picked up with small amounts of drugs. It involved on, lessening the harshness of the penalties. Just a whole range of ways whereby people who were getting arrested for possession, production, sale, purchase of heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, other drugs, rather than being treated in the criminal justice system as if they were murderers and rapists, would be treated more equivalently to low-level, white-collar criminals, or to people committing petty thefts, which seemed morally the way that one might think about this if you were not actually going to go to full legal regulation. And then the last third of our work was about making a serious commitment to treating drug use and addiction as a health issue, not a criminal issue. So we led the way on funding and legalizing needle exchange programs and legal access to sterile syringes in pharmacies back in the late 90s and early aughts. And then we jumped early on to trying to deal with the issue of overdose prevention, beginning in really around 1999, 2000, before this had become such a national crisis. And about educating Americans about European approaches to drugs, and about taking a kind of harm reduction approach to drug education, more of a sex education approach to drug education. So, nobody wants kids to use drugs, but we focused on making sure that you could reduce the likelihood that kids were really going to get hurt by this stuff. So we sort of worked in each of those three big areas, plus a few others. And about 90% of the work was in the U.S., but we also kept our eye on things abroad and helped people internationally as well. And I'd say our first major breakthrough victory was the one that you alluded to there, which was the legalization of medical marijuana in California in 1996, where some local activists had drafted a ballot initiative, but had no chance of getting it on the ballot because you need to collect a lot of signatures for that. So I got involved and was able to raise millions of dollars and get the initiative on the ballot and mount a professional campaign. And that became the first successful kind of breakthrough, medical marijuana initiative. I sometimes say it was the first time that the nascent drug policy reform movement showed that we could play ball in the major leagues of American politics. And we then followed that up with successful medical marijuana initiative victories in Alaska, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, Nevada, and Maine. And then jumped forward another sort of 10, 15 years, became very involved in the efforts to legalize marijuana, not just for medicinal purposes, but for all adults. And, starting off with Colorado and Washington in 2012, and then Oregon and Alaska 2014. And then shortly before I stepped down from running Drug Policy Alliance, we led the effort in California to legalize marijuana there. and helps with the efforts in other states as well. So I should tell you that in early November, I'm flying out to San Francisco because there's going to be a one-day conference organized by California Normal to celebrate the 25th anniversary of California becoming the first state to legalize medical marijuana.
Wow, it's already been 25 years.
Isn't that amazing? One of the things I realized in building Drug Policy Alliance some years ago was that, many of the young people come in to work for me. I mean, they, had barely been born or were in elementary school when marijuana was getting legalized for medical purposes. And many of them were just getting out of high school or even in the middle of high school when Colorado and Washington were legalizing marijuana. So, I realized that, the kind of mindset had shifted. I mean, for me, I got going back in the 80s when, fewer than 30% of Americans wanted to legalize marijuana, and marijuana was legal nowhere. And, by the time I stopped running, DPA, Drug Policy Alliance, in early 2017, we had legalized marijuana in more than two dozen states and legalized it more broadly in 8 states. And we had 55% of the population supporting it. And now you jump forward to where we're sitting in 2021, and medical marijuana is legal in about 3/4 of the state, and it's legal for all adults in about 1/3 of the states or more. And, over 60% of the country says, let's make it legal. And you're even getting a majority of Republicans in some polls and a big majority of young Republicans saying legalize it. So it's really been a dramatic shift in public opinion and public policy that I think the only thing analogous to it really is the movement of the gay rights movement and the legalization of gay marriage, which was in some respects a bit of a role model or elder sibling for those of us fighting for the legalization of marijuana.
There was a story, I just had Maya Solovitz on, and I read her book about harm reduction. There was a story in that book about a woman named Joy Fishman, whose son died of an overdose, and married to Jack Fishman, who patented naloxone, which was tragically kind of ironic. DPA, I think, had some contact with her.
Well, actually, the truth is, I'm the one who brought Joy into the movement. It was fascinating. I was always looking for new donors to support our work, and I was reading an article about the apartment building right down the block from me in Upper West Side of Manhattan called the San Remo. And it mentioned the San Remo being, it was the number one address for Democratic Party fundraisers, but there was a Republican in the building. And I actually happened to have some of my big donors living in that building. And at the very end of the article, it said the Fishmans are also contributing Democrats, and Jack Fishman, was the guy who created naloxone, although he never made a penny from it, actually. I don't think he patented it. He never made a penny from it, but he was a researcher at Rockefeller University who got wealthy through his investments in other ways, but not through naloxone. And so I kind of cold called Joy and said, I saw about this connection. And she said, you don't know the half of it. And I went over to see her. She lived right around the corner from where I live. And she says, let me tell you my story. My husband, Jack, he, invented naloxone. He's my second husband. But I had 2 kids with my first husband. And my son, he had problems with heroin. He got off of it for a while with Ibogaine, actually. And then he was playing around with his friends and did some heroin, and he overdosed, and there was no naloxone around. And they dropped in the emergency room door, and he died on the gate of the emergency room at the hospital. And so, Joy, this bizarre thing where her son from her first marriage dies of an overdose, and the guy she marries when her son's still alive is the guy who created naloxone. So Joy became more and more, we became friends. She started supporting. She was the first person to provide dedicated funding to Drug Policy Alliance to support our overdose prevention work. She recently joined the board of Drug Policy Alliance, and her daughter Julie joined the board of the Harm Reduction Coalition. She then began to get more actively engaged, so she played an important role in helping get needle exchange going in Florida and helping fund a program there at the University of Miami. So she's just a wonderful, wonderful person with an amazing life story, and this, profound tragedy and this profound, kind of, what's the word, coincidence or paradox or whatever, between her second husband and the son from her first marriage.
How important is it to tell personal stories like that with advocacy on some of these reforms? Because that's what we do on here. Part of my podcast is I just have people come on and tell their stories. The other part is I have scientists, experts, and everything like that.
Yeah.
But is that an important aspect in trying to reform?
I mean, Brian, you're kind of asking me a leading question there, but I mean, of course it is. It's really the combination of all these things. I mean, what I found in our advocacy is it's everything from the storytelling to the hardball lobbying to the hardcore drafting of legislative initiatives and ballot initiatives to the litigation in the courts to the very short public education messaging to educating journalists. I mean, it's really to accomplish political change almost anywhere, certainly in America, you oftentimes need these multidimensional efforts. And I think you also have to parse it out. So, for example, in changing public opinion, the personal stories are incredibly compelling because, there was no chance for me to come in there and win ballot initiatives until a majority of the public was already sympathetic to what we wanted to do, to legalize marijuana for medical purposes or more broadly, or to roll back a harsh drug penalty, or to change the asset forfeiture laws, whatever it was. We're not like big corporations, which can, pursue an objective where at the beginning of the year, only 30% of the public supports their objective, but they got enough money that they can ram this messaging to the public and can convert them into supporting, the corporate message just by spending enough money. When you're running a drug policy reform initiative, we're low budget, right? I'm lucky if I can raise a few millions of dollars. I can't raise tens of millions of dollars for these things. So we never did a ballot initiative unless we started off with the public opinion being at least in the range of 55% or more. So the question is, how do you get to it being 55%? And a lot of times, especially in the case of medical marijuana, it was personal stories. It's people know. It turned out that by the time we started, I think 1/3 of Americans knew somebody who they believed used marijuana for medical purposes. I think the same thing about personal stories. When, say, we'd organize a hearing at a state legislature, whether the issue is trying to legalize. Vermont was one of the few states that had not allowed methadone maintenance. So, you get people up there telling their personal stories about how this saved their life, being able to do this, and how they were working full time, even though they've been on methadone for years, and in responsible positions. Or you bring in, the person whose father died of HIV, AIDS, that they contracted through a dirty syringe, and have them testify in the legislature. Or you bring in, a child whose father was just sent to prison for 20 years on a first-time low-level drug sale conviction, right? And when you have these, or you have somebody come in who's, living with MS or HIV and talk about how marijuana has been medically beneficial. And you have those types of stories. And I will tell you, the most cold-hearted pro-drug war Republicans start tearing up and saying, well, let me see if there's something we can do to help these people. So the personal story, it rarely wins on its own, but it is what changes public opinion, and it sometimes is what actually changes the hearts and minds of powerful legislators as well.
Yeah, and I had I was going to ask about naloxone and harm reduction issue in general, because a lot of people who use Kratom are literally using it for harm reduction. Where are we on the availability of harm reduction tools like naloxone and fentanyl test strips for the opioid crisis?
Well, it's a great question, Brian. First of all, on naloxone, there's been a dramatic expansion. I remember when we were fighting the initial efforts, in the state of New Mexico in the late 90s, early 2000s, just to make naloxone available to cops. And there was a kind of transition that happened around 2010 or 11, because until that time, you still had a lot of law enforcement and you had a lot of drug control officials and others saying, why do we want to provide an antidote to an overdose? That'll just give a green light to the junkies that they can go out and use as much drugs as they want, and somebody's going to come there and bail them out. And at some point, the cops, they started coming across enough people dying of overdoses. And the people dying of overdoses, were not just, people living rough on the streets who the cops might have been somewhat callous towards. They were oftentimes, people, neighbors' kids and friends and relatives and all this kind of stuff. And so you began to hear cops saying things like, listen, I'd rather, I'm tired of putting handcuffs on a corpse, right? Mm-hmm. I'd rather be able to save this person's life. And so what then began to happen was cops started asking for permission to carry naloxone, not just the emergency responders. And there began to be a real movement going on there. I remember Obama's drug czar, Bill Kurlikowski, he was initially wary of this issue. And then he did a 180 and really came on board as a big supporter. And then, my organization, Drug Policy Alliance, we focus not just on educating people, about how and why naloxone works, but we also started passing legislation, working with legislators to make naloxone easy to get. Why should one need a prescription for naloxone? It's not a drug you can get high on. There's no reason to restrict control of it. So we started working with legislators to change the laws so people can get naloxone in pharmacies. So I think that naloxone is now more and more available. There are sometimes shortages of supply. There's a company which, has produced a version of it that's the easiest to administer, I think through an inhaler, but has been charging a lot of money for that. Whereas if you're able to kind of, give the naloxone, with a quick prick of a needle, that can cost a tiny fraction. So there's issues of cost and access. But by and large, the resistance to naloxone has faded dramatically from, 10, 12, 15 years ago. When it comes to the drug testing strips, so whereby people can test their drugs, those things are getting out there more. They're not nearly as available as is true in naloxone. And obviously the harm reduction organizations, the ones that work with and try to help people who are using drugs, whether they're coming to a needle exchange program or whether they're working with homeless people or people in the other sorts of help, and their harm reduction programs are working with them in a non-judgmental way. They're obviously making these strips available. But, it would be a lot better if and I know there's an organization called Dance Safe, which is doing everything possible to make these types of things available at electronic music concerts and such. So they're out there in a growing number of places, but still grossly insufficient. And the way they're set up, ideally, you want some reliable person who's at some setting where people may be using drugs, whether it's a club or an event or, out on the streets, where somebody can say, hey, let me know what's in this and what's the potency. Is this real? Is there fentanyl in here? If so, how much? Is there some synthetic cannabinoid? And if so, which one? And what do we, that's what you need to know. And, there's still a very, moralistic, why do we want to, people saying, why would we want to give drug users that information? That'll just encourage them to use drugs. But, that's a little bit like the opposition to providing condoms to U.S. military in World War I, because the moralists would say, well, that will make the U.S. military more likely to go visit a prostitute, Or it was about the people who advocated for alcohol prohibition, kind of being pleased when people would die from drinking wood alcohol, because that would, that would scare people off from, using, good alcohol legally. So there's always that kind of sick group of people in a society who think that people use drugs are better off dead. But I'm happy that we're at least in a phase of American culture and society now where, it's bizarre. Here we have the country more polarized than it's been since, since basically the Civil War period. The most polarized we've been in over 150 years. But somehow the drug issue is attracting more bipartisan consensus than almost any other issue. Yeah. And, I take some pride in that having happened. It's obviously been a huge movement and a huge effort where this drug issue went from being the third rail of American politics to being one of the few areas where we see bipartisan legislation passing with bipartisan support.
Yeah, definitely in the whole Kratom advocacy, it's all over the board as far as politics. Now, they recently there's been CDC guidelines and there's been under-prescribing of opioids, and I've interviewed a lot of people for this podcast that couldn't get opioids for their chronic pain, so they luckily found Kratom, but a lot of people are being turned into street drugs, and they get heroin. They don't know how strong it is, what we were just talking about with fentanyl testing. But do you see the restrictions on opioid prescribing and the increases in overdose as correlated?
Well, listen, first I'll tell you, I have 2 episodes that are forthcoming on the issue that you just mentioned about pain. Okay. One is an interview with the fellow Patrick Radden Keefe, who just wrote the book about the Sackler family. And he's, somebody who's, he basically tells it as a story of what the Sacklers at Purdue Pharma did in grossly over-promoting opioids and promoting it for all sorts of chronic pain where it was not the safest or most responsible option. Although, obviously, opioids can sometimes be right. But the other person I interviewed, who I'm hoping that will go up soon, is a woman named Kate Nicholson, who recently founded the National Pain Advocacy Center. And she's somebody who went through a horrific pain experience of her own. She was, I think she's maybe a Harvard lawyer and was worked in the Justice Department and civil rights. But as a result of her own experience, which she's come through, thank God, she started this organization, National Pain Advocacy Center, basically to advocate on behalf of people who are using opioids responsibly. So oftentimes they've been doing so for years and sometimes to manage their chronic pain, and now are encountering all sorts of prejudice and ignorance and discrimination because they take a daily dose of an opioid. We're aware of the fact now that, opioids should not be used as broadly as they are for chronic pain. But the fact of the matter is there are hundreds of thousands or millions of people who are successfully using opioids to treat their chronic pain, and where it's being more helpful than it would be if they were pushed off of it. And to have people who've been, maintained in a responsible way, all of a sudden dealing with doctors, trying to, withdraw them from their prescriptions. And then they go looking for new doctors, and something like 80% of all doctors would prefer not to have a patient who's maintained on opioids, and 50% won't even take a new patient who's on opioids. I think I have those numbers right there. So we're dealing with a situation where the pendulum, which had swung too far in terms of the overprescribing of opioids for chronic pain, has now swung so far back the other way that people who either do need opioids to treat some short-term pain or even chronic pain, and people who've been on it are really getting screwed. And when you're not treating pain effectively, you are, it's not just the pain. You're making people unable to function. You are increasing the likelihood of them taking their own life. You are increasing the likelihood that they will die sooner than they otherwise would if their pain was successfully managed. So I think this is an increasingly important issue in American drug policy. I'm intending on my podcast to have many more guests talking about the issues of pain and pain management, because let's face it, tens and tens of millions of Americans deal with some form of significant and oftentimes chronic pain in any one year. We have a long way to go in really getting better at integrating the non-opioid ways of dealing with pain. But it needs to be, a fully holistic approach that's tailored for each patient. Not just a one-size-fits-all with either you give the opioid or deny the opioid.
My wife's couple of her friends are nurses, and I was talking to the one about there's a guy in his 70s that's dying of cancer, and they won't give him anything. So it's kind of like gotten to that point in some instances. I think that the kind of the pendulum swung a little bit too far to the other way.
Oh my God! It's not just where the doctors or nurses don't want to give a pain medication even to somebody who's terminally ill. But you then have where somebody who's dying or where their family members say, oh, no, I know I'm in horrific pain, but don't give me any opioids because I don't want to die an addict. And you get the same old bullshit we were dealing with 20, 30 years ago with this extraordinary, what people have called opiophobia and discrimination, where instead of focusing on the underlying quality of life, you look in the UK where they pioneered that kind of hospice system. And when people got into it, when people, were approaching the last weeks or months or maybe a little longer of their life, the focus came on maximizing the quality of their life and minimizing their pain while trying to help them retain, their personhood and their consciousness and all that. And, doctors had the freedom to prescribe whatever was going to work. And that sometimes involved even things like, what street users would call a speedball. It might even involve pharmaceutical heroin and pharmaceutical cocaine or amphetamine or some other opioid. Right? It was all about let's stop with the moral judgment. Let's just make available what's going to maximize the quality of life for this person who doesn't have long to live. And one of the things that always has gets me animated in my opposition to drug war policies and drug war thinking is that we start putting these ideologies and these ignorances above the value and quality of individuals' human lives.
What are your thoughts about decriminalization versus legalization of drugs, just in general?
Well, basically, I would frame it this way, right? Legalization generally refers to making a drug legally available in the way that alcohol or cigarettes have been available, right? Where all people or all adults can basically go in and they don't need a prescription or anything else to get the thing they want, right? And that's now becoming the model for adult use marijuana as well, as we move from medical marijuana to all adult use, right? So I'm clearly an advocate for doing that with respect to marijuana, and I think that's the appropriate model for some of the other drugs that are illegal. Decriminalization generally refers to reducing or eliminating the penalties for personal possession of a substance for one's own use, but keeping the production and the and typically the retail sale of it illegal, right? That's decriminalization. And so oftentimes we see that decriminalization is a kind of, not oftentimes, in the case of marijuana, we saw that either the legalization of marijuana for medical purposes, where you could get it with a doctor's recommendation, or the decriminalization was a kind of stepping stone towards the broader legalization. And when I say legalization, I'm basically defining that as legal regulation, right? People sometimes think the choice is between prohibition on the one hand and free market, no control legalization on the other. Whereas if you think about it hard, critically, you realize that prohibition is actually the abdication of regulation. It's the government saying this is all illegal, and anything that we can suppress is going to be effectively unregulated or de facto regulated by criminal individuals and criminal organizations. Legalization means the government is going to legally regulate this stuff, and those people who operate outside of the legal regulated channels may still have to deal with criminal prosecution. Right. So it's important to understand that legalization means legal regulation. Now, when you're talking about the other drugs, I remain a skeptic of the value of selling heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, new synthetic drugs over the counter the way we do alcohol or cigarettes. Right. I just think that there are real risks associated with doing that. I do, however, think that we should learn the lessons from Europe, where people who have been addicted to street heroin and have been unable to stop by using methadone or buprenorphine, or by going cold turkey, or by trying things like kratom, and are still stuck on their heroin and don't want to be. What you have now in Canada and half dozen European countries are heroin prescription programs, where people who've been addicted to street heroin can go to a clinic up to 3 times a day and get pharmaceutical heroin. They're not allowed to take it home with them. And that's not legalization, but that's a smart, medically oriented approach of making an otherwise illegal drug legally available. I think that what they're doing up in Vancouver in British Columbia with a policy that's now called Safe Supply, and that involves allowing people who are dependent on street drugs to get the drugs they want from a legal source, right? And I think that's an important way, especially in the face of the overdose crisis. I think with cocaine, I can easily see making that available in lower potency forms. I mean, Coca-Cola had cocaine in it until 1900, and so far as we know, the Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola with cocaine in it was no more addictive than Coca-Cola with caffeine is today, right? Yeah. It's all, as they say with drugs, it's all about the dose. The dose can be the medicine, the dose can be the pleasure, or the dose can be the poison, right? So, I mean, the way I tend to think about it, Brian, is that what we're trying to do is to reduce the role of the criminal justice system in drug policy as much as possible, but stopping short at the point at which reducing that role of the criminal justice system invites dramatic increases in drug misuse and abuse, right? So you have to look at this, in terms of not just, I mean, some libertarians would say just legalize it all. From my view, we should be moving in that direction, but it's going to vary depending upon the drug, the form of the drug, the potency of the drug, all of those variables. I will also just say this. I think that with all drugs, there should be no criminal penalty for an individual who possesses a small amount of any drug for their own personal use. So if you got a little heroin, a little cocaine, methamphetamine, synthetic, whatever, if it's basically just for your own use, you should not be treated as a criminal. And that's more or less what Portugal pioneered about 20 years ago. I mean, it's not technically legal, but it's de facto. Nobody's going to jail for possession. And this really path-breaking initiative that Oregon passed 2 ballot initiatives last year. One was to legalize kind of psychedelic medicine up to a certain extent, and use for and personal use. And the other was an initiative that was put forward by my organization, the one that I'm no longer running, Drug Policy Alliance, to end the criminalization of possession of any sort of drug. And that one passed, very healthily in Oregon. So Oregon's become the first state in America which has some degree of all drug decrim.
See, it's kind of like Kratom is in a legal gray area because it's legal, but there's no regulation. So that's what the American Kratom Association, a lot of the advocates, except for the hardcore libertarians, are going for is regulation because we want to know what's in it. There's been issues with toxic metals because of the grinding equipment they're using in Indonesia, where most of the Kratom comes from, is from like the 1950s, and it can leach out lead. So I think there should be regulation.
Yeah, I mean, I gotta say, Brian, I looked before I came on. I looked at your website there, and I thought it was a very responsible introduction to Kratom and talking about the different types of Kratom and the need for better regulation. The issue which has most engaged me since I stepped down from running Drug Policy Alliance 4 years ago is the fight over e-cigarettes and tobacco harm reduction. In fact, that's the subject of the most recent episode of Psychoactive that just went up in the second week of September. And what I'm struck by there is that generally speaking, e-cigarettes, the whole phenomenon of e-cigarettes and the other alternatives to smokable cigarettes may be one of the most important breakthroughs in public health, in modern history. Because it seems to be that people who are significantly addicted to cigarettes and have been unable to quit, that e-cigarettes and some of these other things seem to work better than anything else, better than the patches and the gums and better than the medications and better than going cold turkey and all that. But what happened was, when it became popular among teenagers a few years ago, everybody started freaking out. And paradoxically for me, it was almost the Democrats were acting like drug warriors when it came to the whole e-cigarette thing. And so I'm hoping that this gets resolved in a scientific way. But at the same time, as you're saying with Kratom, we do need the government playing a role regulating these products. Because when it comes to what metals are being used, which of the flavors may have some toxicity associated with them, I mean, I think there's a very powerful need for this stuff to be effectively regulated. And it's why, when I get kind of, I see something like the FDA pursuing a non-science-based approach to Kratom. And I think they're trying to do the right thing on e-cigarettes, but operating under enormous political pressure. you kind of count on these government agencies to do the right thing from a science perspective, and I think they do it more often than not. But the exceptions are really dispiriting.
I mean, when I was a teenager, everybody was smoking cigarettes. It was, it seems like...
Brian, that's exactly it. It is that, yes, it's certainly the case that there are kids out there who never would have smoked cigarettes, but who did get into using the e-cigarettes. But by and large, when you look at the people, the teenagers and other, slightly, older, who have become, quote unquote, addicted to e-cigarettes, they are overwhelmingly the kids who had already used other tobacco products or who would very likely have been able to. I mean, not been able to, very likely would have done so. And then beyond that, when you look at the way in which the adolescent cigarette use dropped more dramatically, percentage-wise, in the last few years, you see that there was clearly some substitution effect whereby teenagers who would have got used cigarettes were instead using e-cigarettes, which are dramatically less dangerous to health. So nobody wants teenagers using any type of drug, right? But the fact of the matter is that the likely risks to teenagers of using e-cigarettes, and very few of them go on to become regular cigarette smokers, the likely risks to them are relatively modest compared to the potential benefits for longtime smokers who are able to make the switch to e-cigarettes. Some of the finest tobacco control experts and researchers and scientists, in the country and the world, are pointing out that e-cigarettes are really a kind of technological breakthrough that could basically save, by which I mean add many years of life for millions, tens of millions of people, Hey, Brian, I should also just say, before we sign off, you're going to ask me about my own involvement with the Kratom issue. But let me just tell that little story, which is that it must have been around 2015 or 16, when I think the DEA was looking to throw Kratom into Schedule 1 or something like
2016,
that. 2016. And so we got some calls from folks in the Kratom world, maybe from the American Kratom Association, maybe others, asking if we could alert our membership. The drug, we had like 250,000 people on our email list. And so, even though we didn't know much about Kratom, we did a little background. We saw, that many people were using it to, get off of opioids, and other people were using it as an alternative for coffee or things like that, and that there might be some risks associated with it, but a lot, And so, but more, we were responding to the principle that the DEA should not be able to just snap its fingers and turn a legal drug into an illegal drug, that there needed to be some real process going on here. So it's sort of a courtesy. We blasted out an email to our list, which was used to getting stuff about marijuana or racism in the drug war or harm reduction. We blasted out a thing to our list, let the DEA know that they should not be criminalizing a drug without any process like this. And to my surprise, we got more feedback from that email blast than almost any other email we had ever sent out. It had to be in the top 3 to 4% of all the emails we sent out. It just seemed to strike a chord. Yeah. And we were inundated from letters and emails from people basically saying, oh, thank you, DPA, for doing this. My God, I was hooked on opioids for years, and my using Kratom was the one thing I'm going to get off. I mean, all of these personal stories. So at that point, I told my folks in D.C. to start engaging a little more closely with American Kratom Association, and one of the manufacturers got in touch with me as well. So I have to say I was struck to realize that there was this dramatic number of people, certainly in the hundreds of thousands, if not the millions, in America, who were using Kratom successfully, and some of whom regarded it as a lifesaver. So I've been very generally sympathetic, to the cause of let's figure out the best ways to legally regulate this stuff responsibly, so that consumers can get it easily and also be assured that the products are safe.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much for doing that. And definitely we could use all the help we can get. In 2013, you told Rolling Stone that you're not fighting for the marbleization of marijuana. Can you talk about where we are today on that? Because I know some of these big cannabis companies are lobbying against home grow, and I just wonder what you think about like home grow in general.
Oh, yeah, basically asking two questions. I mean, on the issue of home grow, I just think that's a matter of principle.
Yeah.
I mean, by and large, people should have the right to grow their own weed for their own use. I mean, that just seems a matter of principle. And there are around this country, significant numbers of people for whom they're growing their own weed is something that is extremely personal. Sometimes it's an economic issue because it's a lot cheaper than buying it in stores. Mm-hmm. But for some of it, it's a more visceral issue. It's almost the way some of the gun advocates, have almost this visceral, relationship to their gun. And there are people in the cannabis world for whom growing their own plant, their own medicine, their own whatever, is a highly personal, intimate act. And when I see people, I played a pivotal role in launching this whole movement and making it real. And when I see guys in the industry opposing the right of people for home grow, I am pissed off to no end. And anytime I have a chance to speak to these folks, I am making it very clear. In fact, I'll sometimes, when I used to be speaking at industry conferences, I would say, I hope that none of you will ever support a law that would ban home grow. I mean, what the hell is the threat to you? And, in the same way that the beer companies and the booze companies are not intimidated by people being allowed to, make their own beer at home or make their own booze at home, get out of it. So that's just core fundamental principle. And I'm very glad to see that almost none of the initiatives or state laws are banning home grow. It's happening a few times, but hopefully those things, and even where they are passing, even where they are banning home grow, I don't think by and large those laws are being enforced. So that's that thing. When it comes to that comment I made in Rolling Stone, some years ago, that I'm not here fighting for the Budweiserization or Marlboroization of marijuana, it was my way of saying, look, we live in America, one of, if not the most dynamic capitalist society in history, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a kind of inevitability about the fact that big corporations are going to play a dominant role in this industry as they have in so many others. I mean, I don't see how you fully stop that. But I said, that being said, there's no reason for us to expedite or facilitate that process. I mean, I kind of, I like the small is beautiful model. I like the idea of finding ways to limit vertical integration so that you can allow the maximum number of players and you don't have single industries controlling the production, the wholesale distribution, and the retail distribution. And, I'm glad to see that when, some of the more progressive laws like the one in New York really make a very keen effort to do that. I'm also sensitive to the fact that when people say to me, so Ethan, when's Congress finally going to legalize marijuana totally? And, I have some ambivalence about that. And so do many of the marijuana people who are operating in the states where marijuana is now legal. Some of whom are not even that small. Because when Congress fully legalizes, that's going to open up the door to big alcohol, big tobacco, big consumer goods, and big pharmaceutical all getting into this industry in a way that we see happening in Canada. And, I think that, right now we have a kind of de facto state protectionism going on for local industries, but I think there are a lot, it may well be the case that the benefits exceed the cost of doing that. So I'm okay with the fact that big alcohol and tobacco, are not yet diving into the cannabis industry. There will be some advantages in terms of, maybe price and product and all that. But I like the way that this has evolved so far. I mean, look, even at this point, most of the people who have been growing marijuana, single farmers, people living off the grid, people doing that, sometimes multi-generation families, for most of them, it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to survive as we move towards legalization. They just don't have the background skills for dealing with government regulation and all the oversight and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. And my single greatest personal regret about having played a key role in the broader legalization of marijuana is the harm that it's doing to the small growers who basically, were providing me and tens of other millions of Americans with our weed for decades, in the face of the criminal law. So what we're really talking about here is, I like the fact that some of the new laws, including the one in New York and others, are doing what they can to help some of the traditional, the people in growing weed make the transition to being legally regulated. I think that's important. But a lot of this is about the kind of smaller companies, some of which are getting bigger. Some of them would like to sell themselves to, big alcohol, big tobacco, big companies. But I'm hoping we don't move that way too fast and that we keep providing some forms of protection for the small growers.
Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on. I really admire those who are fighting for sensible policy on Kratom. I regard them as very much allies with and within the broader drug policy reform movement. And I'm also hopeful that the people who are fighting the good fight on Kratom can see themselves as allied with the broader drug policy reform cause, because it is about the same principles. It is about, sovereignty of our own minds and bodies. It is about government regulation being grounded in science. It's about the rights of consumers, and it's about, helping people live a better quality of life, and whichever psychoactive plants and substances are out there that can help people do that, and where the benefits exceed the risks for the broader society and for most people, let's do it.
The podcast is Psychoactive with Ethan Nadelmann, available at the link in the description or your favorite podcast platform. Dr. Ethan Nadelmann and anybody at the organization he founded, the Drug Policy Alliance, is who to thank if you have access to legal marijuana right now, like I do. Drug Policy Alliance is at drugpolicy.org. Their support on the Kratom issue would be massive, so if you're a Kratom advocate, you might consider joining the Drug Policy Alliance as a member and asking them for help. We need to expand advocacy and not shrink it, obviously. None of the content on this episode or any episode of the Kratom Science Podcast or on any page of kratomscience.com constitutes medical claims or medical advice. The music is Risey, the song is Memories of Thailand. The Kratom Science Podcast is written and produced by me, Brian Gallagher, for kratomscience.com. Take care.